Disclaimer. These stories will contain graphic depictions of horror elements, including, but not limited to, gore, graphic depictions of violence, body horror, murder, just all the horror. So please exercise caution when listening. Good evening. Welcome to Sniper's Creepy Crypt, the spookiest place in the here and there, the place between where you're coming from and where you might never leave. I am Sniper Shadow, and I am here in this our month of the horror and macabre to bring you tales of the utmost terrifying. These tales are not my own. I simply overhear them from passers-by. Sniper's Creepy Crypt is open for 31 days and 31 days only, before it disappears for another year. So join us for some horror from the depths of the hell dimensions.
If you are reading this, then I am dead, and you are standing aboard a derelict Cyclone-class patrol ship, the USS Minstrel, with her engines dead and her electrical system non-functional. I was, the XO of this vessel, Lieutenant Commander Ryan Simmons. Please read this carefully. If you are an officer or an enlisted man in the United States Navy, this is in order. Scuttle this vessel immediately. Do not finish this letter. Get off the Minstrel at once and send her down. Consider this a quarantine scenario. All hands are likely dead. God help you if they are not. We are 8 days out of Kirkwall, tracking an intermittent and scrambled distress call from what appears to be an Icelandic fishing vessel, the Minuskodottir, deep in the no-fishing zone of the North Sea. We found the vessel, or rather, we found a mile-wide streak of oil and fragments, the largest of them still burning. The night before, the enlisted men on watch had reported seeing flashes of light on the horizon. The Minuskodottir's crew was nowhere to be found, except for one lone fisherman, unburned and floating at the far end of the debris field. He had been shot in the forehead by a small-caliber revolver. When we fished his pale blue corpse from the frigid water, he was still clutching a fishing knife in one clamped hand. What we were able to piece together from the fragmented and confounding evidence that was, for reasons unknown, the crew had been in conflict, resulting in the murder of at least one sailor and the eventual sabotage and destruction of the ship. Visibility was only a few hundred feet as we spent the next day drifting silently among the debris in hopes of finding a survivor. The crew was already visibly shaken by the discovery. The grim dread of the fog and the lone smoldering pieces of the Minuskodottir that collided with our hull unsettled even the most seasoned of us. We had expected an easy cruise and the simple retrieval of a dozen thankful Icelandic fishermen. What we got, at first, was a silent and oil-slick-coated sea, a single corpse, and more than a few nagging questions. The Minstrel had just been serviced after an extended tour with the Atlantic Fleet in Bergen, before her transfer to the North Sea. She was in good running order, so I can only assume the initial mechanical failure was an act of sabotage, or of some external force. It happened the first night when our final sweep had been completed, and we returned to the site of the Minuskodottir's first transmission. There was nothing initially remarkable about the spot. A cold and lonely set of coordinates and little else. I was in my cabin just settling down when the call sounded from the captain, offering little information, just a stern order to meet him on deck. Dressing quickly, I emerged from my cabin to a cloud of palpable unease and fear. The enlisted men and the junior officers were coursing through the ship towards the deck like panicked rats. No one made eye contact or spoke. There was none of the usual gallows humor or camaraderie that bubbles up in situations of limited information, just a grim inertia that pulled us out into the Arctic night. On deck, the night was unnaturally clear and cold, and the bright of the stars burned in the frosty air. Around us in every direction, just a few hundred yards away, the fog and clouds whirled, as if held at bay by our presence. The captain was at the railing, leaning over along with the men on watch. I approached him, suddenly desperate and panicked to know what was happening, when I saw it, the light flooding up from underneath us. The sea was flat, like a surface of a mirror. The water was black, reflecting the pale pinpricks of the stars, but beneath the surface something glowed with a cold light. Pulsating shapes of violent green and deep cobalt blue shone from beneath. They flowed and merged and shimmered silently deep below the glassy sea. We stared, 24 men and women, dumbstruck and horrified by the sight. There was a sense of scale that emerged from the fluid movement of the lights. They seemed to be many fathoms beneath us, which would make them terribly large and impossibly fast. There were no solid shapes and no disturbances of the water, just a deep field of liquid flowing light. We watched for what seemed like hours, entranced by the mesmerizing ballad of cold light, a mirror reflection of northern lights. When it ended, abruptly, there was 3 almost simultaneously events. First, the lights seemed to contract, each mote freezing in place and collapsing, like the iris of an eye in a bright sunlight. Secondly, there was a tremor in the air, that first raised hair on the back of my neck. As the ghostly lights winked out of existence, it rose in intensity, until I thought my eyeballs might shake their way out of my head. Through the sudden fog of pain, I heard noise rising above the Arctic wind, a humming vibration from the minstrel herself that seemed to match the electric shuddering in my skull. It was as if every light bulb aboard the minstrel was suddenly flushed with power, flaring bright and buzzing noisily in their housings. And when the wine had reached a fever pitch, they began to pop and shatter among a shatter of sparks. From start to finish, it lasted no less than 2 seconds, and we were left floating silently in the dark waters beneath a starry sky on a dead and crippled boat. The damage was invisible, without any obvious cause, and total. Nothing aboard the minstrel worked. Each carefully crafted system of multiple redundancies had crumbled. Every light was shattered, and even replacement bulbs and small flashlights we carried were fused in useless filaments. Satellite phones, shortwave radios, and all measure of communication were useless bricks of plastic and wire. Every battery was dead. Every stereo system was silent. We were adrift, without a sail or engine, isolated from the world by 100 miles of black and silent sea. The crew moved through the ship at that first night like moles, fumbling through dark corridors with only a few pale green chemical lights to check each system. They relayed each disheartening message like a fire brigade through the darkness, to where the captain and I stood on the deck trying to make sense of the senseless. At last, when nothing else could be done, I fumbled my way back to my cabin and tried to sleep, the darkness feeling like an oppressive, many-fingered hand slowly gripping my chest. The next morning, I again took stock of our situation, hoping for some fragment of hope we had passed by in the night. The damage was total. We would have to find a way to send a distress call and hope that we had not drifted too far from our last known coordinates. The men may not have known the full details, but it was clear from their haunted visages that they knew how dire the situation was. The first death was that afternoon. The sounds of screaming brought me above deck and into a heavy, thick fog. High in the gloom, I could see bright, burning specks of light descending slowly. My stomach churned. It was 2 signal flares drifting uselessly through the haze. Some damn fool had fired the signal flares. I burned with an unfamiliar and foreign rage and rushed through the fog to the foredeck, my hatred in my blood and my fists clamped tight. The scene that emerged from the fog broke me from my stupor. An enlisted man, a flare gun still in his hand, lay broken in a pool of blood. captain stood over him, clutching the railing, driving the heel of his boot repeatedly into the broken mess of the boy's skull. I realized then that the screaming I heard, the high, keening wail, was coming from the captain, his face in a rictus of animal rage. Around them was a small crowd, standing motionless and silent, watching like sentinels. The captain turned to see me and dropped into a crouch, his finger wrapping around the flare gun as he raised it level with my eyes. We stared for a long moment at each other, our eyes locked as he panted heavily, his face lightly splattered with blood. The only sound was the wet, gurgling exhale of the enlisted man's death rattle, a bubble of blood forming from his ruined face. I'd served with this man for nearly a decade. This was not the man I knew. This was a hollow simulacrum, filled with violence and terror. I spoke to him, then, in a soothing voice. I asked him to hand me the flare gun. He said nothing at first, then spoke, his voice a tiny, trembling sound that was swallowed up by the thick gloom around us. He's murdered us, Ryan. The fog. The flares will never... He shook his head and clenched his eyes tight, as if he were trying to shake himself from a dream. Then he shuddered once, violently, his back arcing like a seizure. "This little fuck has killed us," he choked out. The flare gun wavered in the air, and I took a step closer, reaching out for him. He opened his eyes, and I froze again as we stared silently at one another. "You're gonna die here," he giggled quietly. "I always wanted to watch you die, you fucking coward." He tilted his head back and laughed, one hyena-like bark into the grey sky. Then he put the flare gun to his mouth and fired, the last flare igniting and temporarily bathing his head in a halo of magnesium orange and smoke. He tumbled back over the railing. If there was a splash when he hit the water, it was swallowed by the fog. I stood for what seemed like a very long time. It slowly dawned on me that I was alone. The silent audience having melted away below the decks, no doubt taking the grim tale with them. I feared for morale, an absurd concern, I realize now, but I could not move from the spot, as if sheer force of will would cause the sea to regurgitate this man. My friend. The first gunshot broke me from my reverie. In the emergency lockers, I found that a handful of flare guns remained. I stuffed one into each pocket and entered the dim passageway below deck. Over the hollow retort of gunshots, other muffled sounds began to emerge. The choking sobs, the screams of pain and anger, all bringing the faint impression of the copper smell of blood. The dark was oppressive and thick as my heart rose in my chest. The pale, fading light of the chemical glow sticks that hung at regular intervals illuminated the bare corridor, and I moved slowly towards my cabin. I felt the distinct and irrational desire to run onto deck and leap overboard, to swim away from the boat and into the unknown sea. I gripped the flare gun and held it out ahead of me, less like a weapon and more like a talisman, and began to pace slowly down the corridor to the enlisted bunks. The door was wide open, and the smell of blood and fear and shit was nauseating. As my eyes slowly adjusted to the dim, I saw a field of bodies, torn, shredded, and shattered by bullets and makeshift clubs. A few of the men still moved, twitching slightly. I watched in frozen terror as one man, his face a mask of blood and rage, turned up his head to regard me, and with a weak cry of rage began to drag himself with his arms, trailing broken and shattered legs towards me. From the shadows, another form pounced on him, a boot digging into the wounded man's back with a wet, cracking sound. I recognized the attacker's face in the green chemical dim. It was a quiet, bookish young man, like the captain. This was not the man I knew. This was a beast that wore his skin. He reached down and grabbed the wounded man's jaw, thumb slipping into his mouth. The wounded man growled at a feral, mindless sound and tried to bite down, but his attacker gripped tight and pulled. The jaw came off with the sound of tearing tendons and an undulating shriek that vanished into the air. I was no longer breathing. Holding silently at the entrance, but the attacker snapped his head up to see me, nostrils flaring. The jawbone hit the floor with a meaty sound as he lunged towards me with silent animal grace. I fired the flare gun and it hit him square in the chest. His shirt caught fire and all air escaped his lungs with a forceful exhale, but impossibly he continued towards me. As I passed through the portal and slammed the door, the fire had climbed into his hair and he was squealing now as he clawed his hands still outstretched towards me. I felt him impact the door and saw that nightmare visage wreathed in fire through the small porthole, his lips already burnt away to reveal 2 rows of perfect teeth. He wailed and began smashing his burning form against the door. Once. Twice. 3 times. And then silence. I raised my eyes to the porthole and saw only a faint image of the burning shape as it disappeared into the darkness. All conscious thought evaporated and I fled from that carnal house. I have barricaded all entrances below deck now and have doomed myself to the slow death at the hands of the enveloping cold. I can still hear the living ones down there, screaming and banging on the doors. They are not the men I knew. I console myself with this thought as I leave them in the dark to starve to death or murder each other. If you have read this far and have not fled these waters, or God forbid, are still aboard the Minstrel, then I beg you again, leave now while you can. Do not look below deck. There are none of us left to save, and certainly none worth saving. It's cold now, and the fading day surrendering the wane grey into the dark. There are no stars this night, nothing but the heavy blanket of night. If I could get below, I would find some way of destroying the Minstrel, like the brave men of the Mescadota, but it's too late. The most I can make of my last moments, as all feeling flees my extremities and writing becomes impossible, is a warning. Please send us to the deep. Tell no one you found us and never return. There are things and primal desires older than man and forces beyond the grasp of our simple minds that dwell here, beneath the frozen sea.
That concludes our tale for today. Return tomorrow for another horror-filled experience. Wherever you come from and wherever you're going, thank you for spending some time here with us at Sniper's Creepy Crypt. Remember, traveler, eyes ahead, don't look back. Until next time, good night and good luck.